Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting very shortly. Alrighty, good afternoon again. We're going to be starting the presentation or the workshop already. So thank you. There's quite a bit of people on already, so we're gonna get started and go through this to try to get through it, get you guys in and out fairly quickly. By quickly, around an hour-ish. So good afternoon. I'm Rudy Bentoncourt. I'm the director of the CDBG CARES program. Thank you for registering for the Community Resiliency Program NOFA and Application Workshop. Throughout the workshop, we'll be referring to the program as a CRP. Joining me on this presentation, either also presenting or behind the scenes helping answering with questions, will be the team that will work directly with the CRP. We have Raul Salazar, Program Manager, Allison Schur, Program Administrator, Kendall Cotton, Program Coordinator, Lily Alonso, Program Coordinator. Also on the CRP team will be Erica Garza, Program Manager, Katie Wilkerson, Program Coordinator, and Lauren Robbie, Program Coordinator. The team will be offering a lot of staff support for this program to ensure that all projects are successful. And next slide. All right, here's an agenda we'll be following today. We'll be going over the purpose of the program, some housekeeping, an overview of the resiliency program, program information and eligibility, the CRP application instructions and requirements. We'll go into the application portal and the application review, followed by the rating criteria. After that, there will be some federal requirements, and finally, questions and answers. The presentation itself is probably around less than an hour, so we've allowed time for some questions to be answered afterwards if they've not already been answered. So in the question portal, there'll be a lot of questions coming through, and again, staff will be working behind the scenes to try to answer those questions as they come in. Next slide. So again, the purpose of the workshop is to introduce the CRP team, to provide an overview of the program requirements and eligibility, walk you through the application process, and provide guidance on the federal program requirements. And the next slide. Alrighty, before we get into the specifics of the program, here are some housekeeping items for this webinar. The PowerPoint presentations and slides and the webinar recording will be posted on the CDBG CARES CRP website. If you have program questions during the webinar, please use the questions function to submit those. The questions will come directly to the presenters and we can gather them all in one place. Please do not use the chat function for the program-specific questions. Staff will try to answer questions that are asked during the workshop. We will go over unanswered questions at the end of the presentation and do our best to answer those questions. We will also create and post a question and answer document on our website. So in case there are some questions that may lead to some more research and whatnot, we will have those answered for sure. Raul will now dive into the information for the CRP. Next slide.
Okay, good afternoon. Hi. So we've released the NOFA on October 1st, and so this is the overview of it. It's approximately $38 million in CDBG CARES Act funds for the CRP. This program is only for non-entitlement cities and counties, and we're going to keep repeating that and emphasizing that, and then we'll also talk about who's not eligible. This CRP was developed to prepare, prevent, and/or respond to the SARS-CoV-2 or know the coronavirus or the pandemic potential. This funding is also for creating, expanding, or enhancing public facilities and or public services that provide medical care, social services, and or emergency housing, and increasing the community's long-term resiliency and ability to mitigate future coronavirus outbreaks. Next. Okay, next. All right. So we'll just get down to it. You know, the award limits and administration cap. All right. So the award limits are per applicant. Okay. No matter how many projects or you know, no matter how many activities you perform under this grant, your maximum is $5 million, including your admin. And I'll go into that in the next box here. It's administration cap. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hit the minimum of 500,000. Anyway, the administration cap, it is 13% for public facilities and improvements of the project cost amount. So this admin cap, say your project is $5 million, it is not 5 million plus 13%. It has to stay within the total maximum. So it'll be within the total project costs, including admin, is 13% for public facilities. Public service is 5% of the project cost as well. Again, if your public services project is 5 million, it is not 5 million plus 5%. The 5% has to be within that $5 million cap. Next. Okay, the timeline. Okay, so the NOFA was released October 1st, 2021. We are here today on the 13th discussing the NOFA and the application, and hopefully we'll get you into the do's and don'ts and just the specifics of the NOFA and the application. Also, one of the most important dates on here is the application's due date, which is November 30th, 2021. Now we have the next two dates, and the key term here is estimated. And so the estimated award date is going to be January 13th, 2022, and the estimated contract start date is January 15th, 2022. There will be sometimes there's unforeseen circumstances that might push the start date and the award date, but this is what we're going to be shooting for. Okay, next slide. Applicant eligibility. Okay, this is for the applicant. These are threshold criteria. You must be registered on the SAM.gov with no exclusions. Must submit a screenshot with the application. We'll talk about that later, but we will verify. And also must not be suspended or debarred as per the GSA. Must be compliant with Federal Single Audit Act or the Texas Single Audit Act. Also must meet the citizen participation requirements. We'll go further into that later. And must also be approved by the department, which means passing your previous participation review. And you must ensure the project will be ready to proceed upon award. Next slide. Okay, eligibility requirements. Okay, this is for the project and for the applicants. Okay, again, like I said, we were going to emphasize this. This is for non-entitlement cities and counties only. We'll go a little bit deeper into that. The project has to be an eligible activity. We'll go deeper into that. Has to meet the criteria to be a CDBG national objective. We'll explain that as well. And it has to have COVID-19 tieback. And that's the prepare, prevent, and respond to the COVID pandemic. Next slide. Eligible applicants, like we've been saying, is for non-entitlement units of general local government, which is cities and counties, right? So cities with populations of less than 50,000, except for cities that are designated principal cities of metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs, and counties with populations of less than 200,000. Next slide. Ineligible applicants. Okay, ineligible for funding are communities over 50,000 or counties over 200,000 who receive funding directly from HUD. Also, cities that are under 50,000 but are designated principal cities of metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs, and nonprofit organizations are not eligible to apply for this funding directly. Nonprofits are able to subaward or subcontract with a city or county, but a nonprofit cannot apply for CRP program. Next slide. Eligible activities.
Alrighty, I'll go over the eligible activities for this program. So there are 2 eligible activities allowable under this NOFA. The first is the public facilities and improvements with a documented tie back to COVID-19, again, to prepare, prevent, or respond to coronavirus. The categories we are accepting under this activity are acquisition, rehabilitation, and/or new construction. There can be a combination such as acquisition and rehabilitation or acquisition and new construction. Here are a few examples of what that may look like with an example of the national objective in parentheses. Again, these are just examples that we have. Homeless shelters or facilities, domestic violence centers or facilities, health clinics, emergency medical stations, and senior centers or facilities. Now, the allowable administration cost for a public facilities and improvement project is 13%, as Raul mentioned, and the contracts for this activity can go up to 30 months. Next slide. The second eligible activity allowable under this NOFA is public services with a documented tie back to COVID. Examples here are for the purchase of equipment, supplies, and materials necessary to carry out a public service. Examples include mobile food pantries, mobile health clinics, or emergency medical services vehicles. Keep in mind they must meet the national objective of CDBG as well. And the allowable administration cost for this public service activity is 5%. Contracts for this activity can be up to 15 months. Next slide. So the public service must be a new service or a quantifiable increase in the level of an existing service. An exception to this requirement may be made if HUD determines that any decrease in the level of a service was a result of events not within the control of the local government. Next slide. Here are ineligible activities found in the NOFA. With few exceptions, the expansion or enhancement of buildings for the general conduct of government is an ineligible activity. Existing public facility structures may be able to be modified to prevent the transmission of the coronavirus and allow for adequate social distancing or remote access if the facility otherwise meets an eligible activity. So an exception to a government building example could be if a building also has an area that is used for a senior center, for example, again, then that area only can be modified to prevent the transmission of coronavirus. Also, water or wastewater facilities that serve more than the public facility property in the application are ineligible. Projects that will employ eminent domain are ineligible. And the purchase of equipment with CDBG funds is generally ineligible. However, mobile food pantries, mobile health clinics, or emergency medical services vehicles are eligible. And for the purpose of this NOFA, prisons, general park improvements, and construction of new housing are not eligible. Next slide. As you know, an eligibility must be paired with a national objective. Next slide. The national objective that must accompany the eligible activity can be any of the following. Low to moderate income, where at least 51% of the household in the area must be earning 80% or below area median income. Also, LMI area benefit, which is also known as LMA, based on American Community Survey using census geographies. Now, if the community has an already approved HUD survey, it may be used, but please let us know so that we can review and approve it. And also LMI, limited clientele, or LMC. So a presumed benefit or group is also an eligible national objective. This is a facility or service serves persons that qualify as one or more of the following groups: abused children, battered spouses, elderly persons, severely disabled adults, homeless persons, illiterate adults, persons living with AIDS, and or migrant farm workers. Also, household income qualification, where the facility or service requires documentation on family size and income in order to ensure that at least 51% of the beneficiaries are of low to moderate income for use. And lastly, nature and location, where the facility or service is of such nature and in such a location that it can be concluded that the clients are primarily low to moderate income. Next slide. As previously mentioned, there must be a COVID-19 tieback in order to access these funds. The proposed project must be designed to prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus. This tieback may relate to the current pandemic or may relate to mitigating potential future coronavirus pandemic impacts. The PPR tieback guide can be found on the web and can be found here. We will also provide slides of this presentation, and the document can be accessed by clicking the link. Next slide. And the application must ensure there will be no duplication of benefits. A duplication of benefits occurs when an entity or person receives financial assistance from multiple sources intended for the same purpose, or the amount of assistance provided exceeds the total identified need. Each applicant must have procedures to prevent the duplication of benefits, meaning that the cost has not or will not be paid by another source when it provides financial assistance with CDBG-CV funds. Also, a duplication of benefits exhibit or affidavit will be made part of the contract if awarded funding. Therefore, in the application, you can simply explain the efforts the applicant will make to avoid duplication of benefits. Now I'll pass this back to Raul, and he'll go over some of the application components, then we'll dive into the application itself. Next slide.
Thank you, Rudy. Okay, we're going to go down into the CRP application. Okay, some of the most important points here for the application or applications is that for public facilities and improvements, a separate application must be submitted for each activity and must not exceed the total maximum of $5 million, including the admin. So that's if you submit 2 applications with the admin for the project cost, it cannot go over the maximum of $5 million. Now, for public services activity, 1 application may be submitted for 1 or more public service projects. Again, must not exceed the total maximum of $5 million, including the admin. So each activity is a standalone project and requires a complete and separate project budget and key milestones form. Okay, so you can submit 1 application for public services activities, but you have, if it's more than 1 activity, you have to submit more than 1 project budget and key milestones form. And we'll go into that later, see what that looks like within the application. Next. Okay, so there are 2 parts to this application. There's part 1 and a part 2. And part 1 is for, you know, kind of like the general information, organization, and funding requests. You know, these are going to be the contents, A through I. Next slide. Part 2 is project detail. And this is where it really, really digs down into the finer points of your project and what we will need to be able to proceed with your project. So again, 2 parts, part 1, part 2 are required. Next slide.
All right, I'm gonna switch screens real quick so that I can share my screen with you guys. Okay. Can everybody see the same slide? Where we get going?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're going to shift gears and look in more detail at the actual application and the process for completing it. So as you can see, the NOFA and the CRP application instructions are both documents that will be helpful for you for completing the application. So I would encourage you to review both of those things before getting started on your application. Just a reminder that the application and all the required attachments must be received by the department through our online Smartsheet application portal, which we're going to look at in just 1 second, no later than 5 p.m. Austin Standard Time on November 30th, 2021. So the only way to submit the application is through the online portal. You have submitted through email or on paper. And you'll notice that it says Austin Standard Time. That's the same as Central Standard Time. Any applications that are received after 5 p.m. on November 30th will be disqualified and not reviewed, and that will be communicated to you through an email if that were to happen. So we are going to click on, actually we're going to start by looking at the CRP webpage. So there's a couple of places that have information that you guys will need to fill out the application. So we're going to start here as kind of your landing board. So this is actually a webpage on the TDHCA website. So for the Texas Community Resiliency Program, you'll notice that it has just kind of an overview of the program. It has links to the NOFA, the application materials, important dates. This is a good site to bookmark because this is where we're going to continue to update information about the program. This is where we'll post the slides from today's webinar as well as the recording. So this is a good kind of first page to find what you may be looking for. You'll notice right here that there's a link to the online application, the Smartsheet tool. So we're going to click on that. And that's going to take you into our application portal. This page contains all the information that you'll need to complete and submit an application for CRP funds. So you'll notice right here, part 1 and part 2 of the application. So as Raul was saying, it's broken into 2 parts, and these are the links that will take you to each part of the application. The middle section includes all the different forms and documents that you would need to complete it, and we'll go through each of these individually in just one moment. And then over here on the right, we have updates with timelines, the link to the CRP webpage, a link to subscribe to our email notifications about the CRP program. And so this is just kind of our one-stop shop for everything that you're going to need to complete your application. So what we're going to start with is just looking at part 1 of the application so you can kind of see what it looks like, what you'll be completing. So when you open that, it'll take you directly to the page that you're going to fill out. You'll notice that you're in part 1. It says organization and funding request. As you scroll down, you'll see a summary description of the program, information about the deadline, the different application sections that Raul just mentioned. These are the parts of the application of part 1. And then we get to some important notes. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. So we're going to touch on these, and we'll do a reminder about this stuff at the end. But just as Raul mentioned, for public facilities and improvement applications, you have to complete a separate application, which means both part 1 and 2, for each activity or project that you're applying for. And for the total of all your applications, the maximum request is $5 million and the minimum is $500,000. As he mentioned, for public services, you can submit one application for more than one public service project, but you would need to complete a separate project budget and key milestones form for each project or activity that you are applying for. And then just some things to keep in mind as you're filling this out. So once you submit the Smartsheet, you will not be able to go back and update or edit your application. So it's important to make sure all of your information is prepared the way you want it before you begin working in the Smartsheet. You also are not able to save your work and come back to it later. So you couldn't fill out half the application, save it, and come back tomorrow to finish it up. And we know that this is a lot of information. So we've created a Word version of the application that mirrors the smart sheet that you can use to prepare your responses before you even begin working in this link. And we'll look at that. It's linked back here on the portal right here, and we'll look at it in just one moment. Another thing to know is that portions of the application are going to populate based on your specific project and the type of project you're doing. So you may not see every single question. So for example, if you're doing a new construction project, you will not see questions related to acquisition or rehab. So the way you answer the questions will generate other questions to appear as you're filling out the application. And then just as they mentioned before, except as outlined in the NOFA, the Executive Award Recommendation Committee will not recommend more than $5 million for all activities and projects for one entity or community. And so we're just going to kind of scroll through and look at the application so you can see what's in here, what it looks like. Section A is just general applicant information, your contact information. Some of these are that you just type into, some of these are drop-down fields. We ask for your DUNS number, your federal ID number. Section B is staff contact information. So for each of these roles, who's a good contact for the application, who would be the executor, who would be signing the contract, who would be responsible for oversight and management of the project. And then we have an opportunity to provide another contact if there's someone else that should be included. Most of this is self-explanatory, but you'll notice down here, question number 5 is about who needs access to the housing contract system. That's the database that we use internally to manage TDHCA contracts, and that's where you would go in and submit your draw request, enter reporting, be able to access contract documents. So you would be able to decide, if each of these people needs access to the system and indicate yes or no. Section C is talking about financial stability. So this is just giving you more information about the financial documents that we're going to be requesting. There's not a question to answer here. It's more just making sure that you understand what information needs to be uploaded as an attachment at the end of the document, at the end of the application. Section D talks about the national objective and project beneficiaries. So Rudy mentioned this previously when he was talking about national objectives. So this is going to give you an opportunity to provide more information about how your project will meet the national objective and who your project will be benefiting. So this is an example of a question where, depending on how you answer it, you might get a second question that populates. So for example, if your project is going to be serving a HUD presumed benefit group, it's going to generate this question for you to identify what group will be benefiting. And then if you select entire community, it's going to ask you a different question. So there are categories that will appear separately depending on how you answer a question. And then there's also follow-up questions that can appear throughout the application. Section E is just more information about your project. So the name, the description, eligibility, the project need. This is where you would indicate the COVID tieback. So as they mentioned earlier, that's a requirement for this program. So this is where you would provide that information, the project term, and the total funding that you're requesting through CRP. One thing to note in this section is if you are applying for more than one public service project, so for example, a mobile food pantry and a mobile health clinic, so 2 different types of public service projects, we would want you to provide information about each of those projects in the description and just indicate which one you're referring to. Section F is just getting more information about how your project will be administered and how oversight will be handled. So who will be responsible for that, acknowledgement of the project administration cap, whether or not you intend to work with a third party, consultant or nonprofit, whether you will be using a federally approved indirect cost rate. And then section G is just getting more information about your experience with these types of projects and how you'll be managing oversight, compliance monitoring, and closeout of your project. And then at the bottom is a list of attachments. And so for part 1, there's attachments in both part 1 and part 2 of the application that are specific to that portion of the application. In part 1, we're asking you to attach each of these forms separately as a separate upload. So there's a box at the bottom of the attachment section where you can drag your files or select the files to be uploaded. All of these are also listed on a application checklist form that we're going to look at. So again, back on the portal, the application attachments checklist here, we're going to look at that in just a second, but it lists all of these documents and also has the same links. But you can see that when you click on one of these links, it will take you directly to the document that you can just type into and then download and save it to upload on the application. So this is part 1, attachments. At the bottom, there's a section to add any comments that you want to include about your application, certify your application, and then we encourage you to click the box to get a copy of your responses sent directly to you. And then after you hit the submit button, it'll take you to a confirmation page that will let you know your responses have been submitted. And at that point, you can no longer edit the responses to the application. So that's part 1. Let's go back over here and we're going to go look at part 2. So it looks very similar. You see it says part 2 project detail. So this is where we're really getting into more specifics, the meat of your project and what it's going to look like. Again, reminders about the deadlines and how to fill out the application, the different application sections. You'll see a note right here that for these sections below, some of those sections will only populate based on the answers to what type of project you're doing. So we get into, again, section A is just a little bit of follow-up information. So we know whose part 2 application this is. And then we get into project type. So the eligible activities, is it public facilities and improvements or public service? And depending on how you answer these questions, more questions are going to populate. So you can see if I scroll down now, there's really not many questions there before we get to the attachments. But as I start selecting these public facilities, it's going to ask you what type of construction project you're doing. So it may be acquisition and rehab. You'll see that we now can see the questions for acquisition, construction detail, and rehab. So the way the application looks when you first open it is not going to be comprehensive of all the questions. I'm just going to select all the boxes right now so that we're able to scroll through and look at everything together. Question 2, we're asking for more information about the design of your project. This is also where you would note how you're going to be adhering to the duplication of benefits requirements. Rudy mentioned that earlier, that we're just asking you to explain that in the application itself. Section C will only be filled out if you are applying for a public service purchase project. So if you're only doing construction, this section will not be visible to you. We're asking for your project justification and your current procurement status. Project location will be filled out regardless of what type of project you're submitting. This is just general location information. We ask for the census tract, more information about whether the site is leased or owned, or if that's not applicable. Then we get down into the sections that are based on your project. So section E is more questions around property acquisition. And in here, you'll notice that there are some of these questions. I'm just going to click in here until one pops up, where if you answer yes, a new question may pop up. So for example, number 5, does the project require land use or a zoning change? If you answer yes, it's going to ask you for more information. And you can see that those are linked because this is question 5 and this is question 5A. In the Word document, you're going to be able to see all the questions without obviously you can't click on anything in the Word doc and have it generate. So you'll be able to see all the questions as you're preparing your responses. Section F is construction detail, so just more information about the construction plans for the project. Section G is only if you're doing a rehab project. And this is another one where if you say yes, it's going to pop up a new question. Section H is on environmental clearance, and so there will be more details about environmental review as we continue with the presentation. At this point, nothing is required at the time of application submittal that any environmental review has been done. But if someone has already started that process, we want to know more about where they are in the process and what they have found out. And then just like in part 1, we have our list of attachments. So there's a long list here, but these are not all required. A lot of these attachments are going to be based on the specifics of your project. So if you're not doing an acquisition project, you won't need to submit any of these attachments. One thing that's a little different between part 1 and part 2 in the attachments is in part 1, we ask you to upload them separately as separate documents. And in part 2, we just want you to put all of the attachments into one PDF and upload them together. We're providing some cover pages that we'll look at when we go back to the application portal to help separate the different sections. But that is a lot of documents, and I think that will be easier for everyone, for you guys, for us, to keep them all together so nothing gets lost in the process. Again, we have our upload box, the comments field, your certification of the application, and a box to check so that you can get a copy of your responses. And again, once you hit submit, it'll take you to a screen that verifies your responses have been submitted. So that is the actual application itself. So let's go back to the portal and look at what all you may need to complete the application. So I mentioned the application's attachment checklist. Let me open that for you and we'll take a look at it. So this is the checklist. So this just mirrors what's listed in part 1 and part 2 of the attachment. So part 1 is listed in blue, part 2 is in orange, it has notes, the same links are available here, and they'll take you directly to those same documents as you open them. We have this handy little check boxes over here so you can keep track on your own of whether this is a document that you need and whether it's been submitted as part of the packet. The other thing to note is if you type your name, your community name up here, then it will automatically populate on all the other pages. So the other tabs on this sheet are the cover sheet. So this is what you would use to separate the documents that you're uploading. There was a long list of different sections. If we go back and look at the attachments here, oops, it's part 1. So you'll see section H, section G, section F, and it tells you what question the attachment corresponds to. So these, where it says cover page, is where you would submit the cover page between your documents, and they're all linked to the attachments checklist. Go back up here. Okay, let's go back into the portal. The next thing is the previous participation review form. And let's see what it looks like. Here's the form that you'd be filling out. The next is the instructions for that form. I'll help you fill it out. The direct deposit authorization form, you can type directly into these PDFs. The application for Texas identification number. The information security and privacy agreement. So this link is going to take you to a TDHCA website that gives you more information about the form, what it is, and how to fill it out. For the purposes that you'll be using, you would be using example 2 as the way that you fill out the ISPA. You can click here to actually download a copy of the form. And it looks like this. And this is the one that does not actually get uploaded as part of the attachment. So let's see if we go back to part 1, you'll see that it says, please submit to Jeff Pinder this is his email address. It would be sent directly to him. And if you have filled this form out previously, if if you've had a prior contract with TDHCA and you know that you've already done this form, you don't need to submit a new one. You can just let us know that you've completed it in the past so we can verify that we have your signed agreement. And then the project budget and key milestones form. So we've referenced this a couple of times when talking about, if you're submitting multiple projects in one application, we need a project budget and milestone form for each project. So this is what that looks like. The green tabs are for public facilities and construction projects, for public facilities and improvement projects. The blue tabs are for public service purchase projects. And just like in the checklist and the cover pages, if you type your name in here, it will automatically populate on the other fields. One thing to keep in mind is that these are preliminary budget and milestone tables. So if your project is selected for award, we'll ask for a final updated budget and milestone table that will be included as part of your contract. So the way this works is we have two columns here. One is for the estimated total project cost. The second column is for the portion of the project that would be funded with CRP funds. Ideally, what we're envisioning is that the project will be fully funded with CRP funds, so these columns would be identical. No matching funds are required for these projects, but if that's not the case for your project, then you would over here only include the portion that would be funded with CRP. And this budget will automatically self-calculate. It'll sum your totals down at the bottom, and it's also going to automatically calculate your admin budget based on your project cost. So it's calculating 13% of your project cost and then giving you a total cost right here. Same thing for public service. It's pretty simple. You're just putting in your project cost, and then it will calculate your admin budget as well and give you a total project request down here. There's a key milestones table for both of these. Let's see, we'll look at public facilities improvements first. So we would like a realistic project timeline showing when you think that each of these things will be completed. You can add to it if there's things that we have not included that you want to note. Same for public service purchase milestones. And this document gets uploaded as an attachment to part 1 of the application. We've also included a link to the NOFA. So as I mentioned earlier, this will be important to review as you're filling out the application. The application instructions are linked as well. So this is just, it goes into more detail about some specific things to keep in mind when filling out the application. A lot of the same information that's in the NOFA and that's covered in this webinar, but more succinct and put into a document that helps make it easier to access. So I encourage you to read both of those things as you're going through this process. And then the CRP Word version of the application. So I mentioned this earlier. This is what you'll be using to prepare your responses before entering information into the Smart Sheet. Trying to open, let's see. Just 1 second. Come on. Thank you for your patience. My computer's having a rough day. There we go. Yeah. All right, I'll give that a second to open. Here we go. So like I mentioned, this mirrors what's in the Smart Sheet. So you're going to have your overview, your deadline, your application sections, the important notes, and then you would just be able to scroll down and fill out the application just like you would in the Smart Sheet. So it mirrors it, and then you can copy and paste directly from here into the document. So another thing to make a note of is when it opens, you may have to click a button that says edit document to get it in the right format where you can type into it. Mine's in a read-only mode right now, so it looks slightly different. but sometimes there's a little button right here that says edit document or enable fields. So for example, if I were just to type in, this is our mailing address, and then I wanted to put that into the smart sheet, I'm just going to copy it, go into our application. You can see that I can just paste it directly in there. So this is kind of your way to prepare your responses in advance. Multiple people can work on this together and save it and refine it over time until you get ready to submit. And it has the, if you scroll all the way through, it has a link, it has the attachments for part 1, a link to the checklist here, and then it switches over to part 2 of the application. It is important to note that this is not eligible to be submitted as your application. It must be, the information must be taken from this document and put into the smart sheet form. All right. So that's all of the forms that are included. And then over here, you can just see that we have information that may be helpful. The registration for this workshop that you're attending, the deadline, the anticipated start date. So we will update this information as things change with the program or as we get more information. This links you directly back to the CRP webpage if you have questions on that. All right, so let me go back to my presentation. And these are mostly things that we have already reviewed on this slide while we were looking at the actual application. But just reminders, it has to be completed in one session. Once it's submitted, you'll not be able to update or revise it. The Word version is available to help you prepare your responses, and you can copy and paste from the application into the online application. And then the portions of the application will populate based on the project and specifics of your application. So don't be concerned if you're not seeing something in the smart sheet that you do see in the Word document if it's not a relevant question for your application. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Raul at this point.
Yes, okay,
right.
Next slide, please. All right, application scoring criteria. Okay, so the rating criteria, these are the major categories in our scoring matrix. There are subcategories within each one of these. But for these, the description of the project, you can get up to 15 points. For planning and budgeting, up to 15 points. Administrative and financial capacity, up to 30 points. And for project readiness, it's up to 40 points. It's a total of 100 points. You can self-score your application. Of course, we will score your application. In the case of a tie, we what we have put into place is the tiebreaker. The first tiebreaker is that if the CRP project is fully funded with CRP funds, that will break the tie. The next tiebreaker will be whether it will be a public facilities versus a public service application. And so a public facilities will beat the tie on a public service project. And also in the event of a continued tie, the department will then use a random drawing selection method. And next slide. Okay.
Alrighty, I'll be going over the federal requirements, some of the federal requirements. They're very detailed in the NOFA. However, these are some of the key points we want to target or touch up on. Next slide. Alrighty, in order to receive funding under a non-entitlement project, a citizen participation must be followed. So the state is required to confirm that a non-entitlement local government applying for CDBG funds conduct a minimum of two public meetings each at a different stage of the project. One before the submission of the local government application to TDHCA, will be allowed. Both hearings must be advertised as described in the applicant's citizen participation plan, and CDBG-CV public hearings must be held no less than 5 days after the date of publication. HUD has allowed a 5-day comment period and has also allowed virtual public hearings due to the pandemic. Next slide. Because the public hearing is an open meeting, you will have to follow the record-keeping requirements of the Texas Open Meetings Act as implemented by the applicant's city or county. To qualify as a public hearing, to qualify as a public hearing, it does need to be an action item. So the first public hearing should be held prior to the submission of the application. The notice should include enough information about the applicable funding and allowable activities to allow citizens to be able to provide input. We are requiring a resolution to accompany the application. This should include the description of the proposed project or activities, amount of funding requested, and the total cost of the activity if these amounts are different. Authorizing application submission, the name of the representative having signature authority, and the date the resolution was passed. Also, a copy of the publisher's affidavit and a copy of the notice or advertisement, which includes available funding, allowable activities, and where citizens were given at least 5 days to provide input. The second public hearing is also required, but not required to submit this application. A second public hearing with the application is preferred. However, points will not be deducted if that is not the case. If awarded funding for the project and prior to execution of the contract, the department will require documentation of a second public hearing to adhere to CDBG requirements. Next slide. An environmental review will be required for each funded project. CDBG-CVs are required to comply with the following statutory and regulatory requirements for the environmental review. These are 24 CFR Part 58 and the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. CDBG grantees are required to complete the appropriate level of environmental review within 60 days after the contract start date or within 90 days if an environmental assessment is required. So for example, a categorically excluded project, either subject to or not subject to, the amount of days required to submit to the department is within 60 days after signing the contract. CRP funds cannot be dispersed before an environmental review has been conducted and cleared by the department. Next slide. All normal CDBG procurement requirements must be in place if seeking any form of reimbursement from the CDBG-CV funding. These include 2 CFR 200, 24 CFR Part 75, and the applicant's CDBG procurement policy if applicable. Failure to meet procurement requirements may result in disqualification, recapture of federal funds, and disbarment. We have received several questions regarding procurement already of procurement of professional services. So in order to receive reimbursement for any CDBG activity for which the community is seeking reimbursement, 2 CFR 200 must be followed. However, if no reimbursement is being sought, 2 CFR 200 does not have to be followed. Next slide. Here are a list of some cross-cutting requirements. There's in the NOFA on pages 15 and 16, there are a total of 17 cross-cutting requirements. These are just to name a few, but you'll find the rest in the NOFA. So acquisition and relocation requirements, financial management, labor standards, regulations, civil rights and equal opportunity requirements. These are just to name a few of the several that are required under the CDBG-CV program. Next slide. So keep in mind, so the next steps are review the NOFA and application documents on our website, prepare responses using the Word version of the application, and that's going to be the best way to go forward with that, and then transfer it over to the Smartsheet, and apply for CRP funds. And again, this is due by 5 p.m. Austin Standard Time, which is Central Standard Time, on November 30th. And keep in mind, what we're looking for in regards to an application on November 30th is a well thought out, viable project that is ready to move quickly once a contract has been executed. Next slide. Oh, alrighty, we've reached the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, please email crp@tdhca.state.tx.us. That email will come to the team, and we'll respond to that. Also, if you'd like to meet with the team or anyone on the team to talk about any kind of proposed project you may have, or have any questions that would be specifically to your non-entitlement community, we will be available to be able to help answer those. And lastly, we'll post the questions and answers of all the questions that have been asked during this workshop, along with other questions we've already received. We'll post it on the CDBG Cares CRP website that's listed here as well. With that, that's the end of the presentation. So we can jump into the questions that have been popping up. Let's see. Raul, do you have any that are outstanding that we haven't just answered yet?
Yes, we do, Rudy.
Okay.
Let me see here real quick. It just shut me off where okay, so can we use CDBG procurement process?
Right, yes. The CDBG procurement process that I just went over, the two, let's see, the 2 CFR 200 and 24 CFR Part 75, those are the CDBG procurements that we're required to follow.
Okay, what does environmental reports refer to in the budget and milestones sheet form?
That's a general line item that we have there. So if there's any costs that are associated to the environmental review, that's where we're looking for the dollar amount and how long it would take to complete those. That's what we're looking for there, to make sure you include it in those budget and milestone areas.
Okay, if purchasing vehicles, sorry, I skipped one. Here, please provide a non-entitlement map or form. We can guide you along when we post the Q&As. We can address the non-entitlement areas in the state. You were going to say something, Rudy?
No, I was just going to say there's a slide. Looking for the slide that we went over what is considered a non-entitlement. Basically, a non-entitlement is if your community does not already receive HUD funding on an annual basis. Typically, it's a non-entitlement, but you provided the specifics. I'm looking for that information. So non-entitlement is really going to be a city with a population of less than 50,000, except cities that are designated as metropolitan statistical areas, or counties with populations of less than 200,000. That's what's considered a non-entitlement.
Okay. If purchasing vehicles as a public services project, many vendors are taking longer than 15 months to deliver. What allowances or waivers will be allowed to the 15-month services contract term?
We will have to take that on a case-by-case basis. We were providing more of an estimate. I mean, I know that there's the 15-month. We have it for 15 months in the NOFA of what would be allowable for public service. However, we're also running programs now that we've been able to extend depending on the situation. So prior to, I would say prior to the submitting the what type of vehicle you're looking at and the timeline that you get with staff to that way we can run that up our side and hopefully come to a somewhere in the middle on that.
Okay. What stage of environmental and design must be completed to receive partial points? Can these activities just have been begun? Must they be 30% complete or 100% complete?
So the matrix goes into it a little bit more to talk about the matrix on the NOFA. It goes into it. So, you know, some of the environmental reviews, such as categorically categorically excluded, subject to, or not subject to, you know, just from experience and what we've seen is that they wouldn't take 60 days, but there are favorable points to those projects that may have already either been completed or are at a certain phase. So the matrix on the NOFA will go into what points are allowable, or what maximum points would be given to projects like that, depending on the stage.
Okay. Can we use the TDHCA 506 process for procurement?
I am not familiar with that process, but we can, if you can send us an email to the crp@tdhca.state.tx.us, we can, if you can send us an email to that, we will inquire and get that information.
Okay. Can communities apply to demolish and reconstruct in the same property, or is the only rehab without full demolition?
We're looking at all types of projects at this point. Rehabilitation, sometimes it does require, for rehabilitation, sometimes it does require some type of demolition. So we can definitely look at what a project is. I mean, we know that there's not these perfect cookie cutter projects that you're just going to acquire and rehab or just rehab. So, you know, we just gave examples of what what they could be. But I mean, I know I've worked with projects before where it does require some type of demolition in order to conduct the rehab.
Okay. Yes, the slides will be presented. I mean, posted, sorry, on our website. So I just went ahead and answered that, Rudy. All right, can the application be filled out and submitted by a consultant procured by the applicant, city, county, or does the applicant's authorized official have to submit it?
It basically, as long as all the requirements are in there. I mean, I do have to point out that if an applicant is submitting, or if a consultant is submitting the application and working with the non-entitlement, they have to follow the procurement policies if they're wanting to get reimbursed for the project. I mean, we have had questions where a non-entitlement is using their general fund to procure a consultant, and then, you know, the 2 CFR 200 doesn't have to be followed.
Okay. If purchasing vehicles for services project, will a vendor quote be required to be submitted? If so, will that disallow that specific vendor to be procured to deliver vehicle if awarded? Will this be considered a conflict of interest?
Let's see. Doug, do you have a response to that? That's a really good question.
Can you repeat the question, Roel?
Yes, of course.
Understand it.
Okay, no problem. If purchasing vehicles for a public services project, will a vendor quote be required to be submitted? If so, will that disallow that specific vendor to be procured to deliver vehicle if awarded? Will this be considered a conflict of interest?
So the best answer I can give is that for the purchase of a vehicle under 2 CFR procurement requirements, some form of informal bidding would be required. And so some of this is dependent upon how TDHC wants to manage this kind of thing, but that would typically require bids for a certain type of vehicle could be specified, et cetera, as needed, but then hopefully more than one vendor responds to that procurement request, which doesn't create a sole source situation. If it does create a sole source situation, then that would have to be vetted with TDHCA to make sure that that's an acceptable way to procure the vehicle. I don't know if it's considered a conflict of interest as much as a procurement issue.
Right. Thank you, Doug. Must the submitted budget be signed by an architect or the applicant?
Basically it's a table that we're asking for, so it doesn't have to be signed by the architect, but the applicant. It's going to come in the entire package of the application, and again, this is just going to be a preliminary budget and schedule. If the project is funded, then we're going to ask for a final budget and schedule that'll be part of the contract.
Is the environmental review included in project delivery or administrative costs? It is project costs. The environmental review is a project cost.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention.
Yes. Is there a local match? No local match required. In cities that are not citywide LMI, how does a city use survey data to support a public facility, and how will that city be the gatekeeper of residents benefiting from the facility?
The burden is just to meet the national objectives. So, I mean, in some cases, surveys are not needed to be used. When I made that comment is that under the TDA, Texas Department of Agriculture, there are already some, they're already working with some folks that have used surveys that have been approved by HUD or have been HUD approved type surveys. So those could be used. But primarily it's the national objective that we're looking for. So it's going to be who's going to benefit from this activity. If it's going to be citywide, then we have to ask that at least whoever's benefiting from the activity, at least 51% or more, meet the 80% or less area median income.
Okay. Is there a definition of low to moderate income? Is there a website or tool we can use to determine it?
We can include that in our Q&A, but we typically follow HUD's definition of low to moderate income person.
Okay. What reporting requirements will be required for services projects? Facilities require reporting for a 5-year time period. Is there a similar reporting requirement for services projects?
Any project is really still your CDBG 5-year same use type of project, or same use, right? Same use. So again, once this project is closed out on IDIS, which is the database that we use with HUD, then the 5-year clock starts there.
Are force account personnel, i.e. public safety personnel, eligible to be utilized in a public services project?
Force account personnel.
Force account, i.e. public safety personnel.
I would say that we're going to have to look at that question deeper and provide that response in the Q&A document. I don't think it's an easy answer.
Okay, can you repeat the part about a consultant submitting the application on behalf of a city?
Sure, that's going to fall back on procurement. So therefore, if CDBG procurement is not followed, then we cannot reimburse. And I know you had a statement on that, Raul, about disqualification. Is this where this applies as well?
Right. If someone is doing the grant writing, they cannot manage the grant outside of grant writing.
If they didn't follow the
conflict. Yeah, it's a conflict of interest.
Okay, so that's only if they did not follow the procurement, the CDBG procurement. So, okay. And then we can get with you, Ms. Murphy. I know there's been some questions that we can definitely get with you as a team to go over those responses.
So if it says, if it's multiple counties, how do you calculate AMI? The service area cannot be more than one county. And so it would, a multiple county project would be disallowed. Do we need 3 bids for purchases?
You would need to follow the procurement, and depending on the amounts that there are, so you would have to follow the procurement requirements.
Exactly, definitely depends on the aggregate amount of the purchase. What is defined as shovel ready? After reading the ready criteria, it states resources such as funding, identified, and site control needed to carry out the proposed project are available and ready. Does that mean procured or ready for procurement, signature of contract for the build, acquisition?
So when we're looking for shovel ready, when we're saying shovel ready, we just want that the project, again, has been well thought out. And as we're reviewing the application and scoring the application, we are confident that as soon as there is a contract in place, that this project is going to start, versus something not being shovel ready, as the whole concept of the project has not been thought out. A lot of those things that we're looking for are not in place, so those aren't going to score as one project that would be shovel ready, would score.
Okay, if a non-LMI community constructs a senior center or a homeless shelter using the LMC criteria, will they be able to use the facility as a shelter for non-LMI residents in extreme or hazardous circumstances, or can this facility in all circumstances only serve LMC persons?
No, because I guess the answer to the question at the end, it would be no, because of course, the whole purpose of this and the tieback would be to prepare, a community for any, either continued pandemic or any future pandemic. So, a type of project that is primarily used for the LMI or LMC is the ideal, and and having it being able to alter to respond to any future pandemics, would be fine.
Okay. There's a question here that seems to be a continuation of another question, and I can't piece it together. So Patrick Wiltshire, if you want to submit your entire question, that'd be great. Thank you.
Oh, no, I know that. I know. Let me see. I already lost my place here. What if those funds are paid with local funds? I'm assuming if the question is if the working with a consultant is paid with local funds, then if they're paid with local funds and you're not you're not requesting reimbursement from the project, then that's fine. As long as you're not requesting reimbursement for the consultation, then they don't have to follow the procurement.
Do projects have to qualify through the LMA National Program Objective, or can they qualify through the Slum and Blight or Urgent Need?
We cannot do anything through urgent need. We've reached our cap there, so they would have to be through the LMI National Objective. As per the NOFA.
Also, no Slum and Blight. Okay, let's see. There's a statement, not a question. What if a city or county pays PD or admin with local funds? How can the budget table be revised to exclude this calculation? Patrick Wiltshire.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm only assuming PD. I guess I don't want to assume what PD is. If you can clarify that, but it almost sounds like we would have to answer that specifically in the Q&A.
Okay.
But there will be I'm sorry. I believe in the table I may have seen something like other, but I mean, if you can explain in the actual NOFA or provide either an attachment or something, then we could decipher that.
Oh, I see. He's asking how they can so I guess they're thinking of paying all the admin with just their local funds, and they're trying to see if they can get a budget form without the 13 and the 5% calculation. Patrick, we can provide that to you. If you email the CRP email address shown on the screen requesting that, we will get it to you without the 13 and 5% calculation.
Okay,
But,
I get it now.
Okay, you get it? All right, thank you. And so how are organizations rated or assessed under the rating criteria? For applicant experience with federal and state funding under the admin cap and financial capacity section?
How are organizations rated?
I believe so, yes.
Well, I know we do also ask for a statement in the application. I know Allison went through it, but kind of in general, just to give everyone an idea of what the application consists of. But there are sections that that we made sure to receive some kind of narrative to where we understand what y'all, or what the applicant has experience in with other other funding, whether federal or state. So that would be something that's explained, and then we basically review that information and are able to to make that scoring there.
That is the last question I have on the questions portal.
Yeah, can we get the entire presentation? Yeah, what we can do also is everybody that I know an application or some email reminders went out. So what we can do is we'll try to piggyback on that and send this out as well. But it will also be on the website. I mean, we'll put it on the website. We'll shoot for by the end of the week, but we might be able to do it either sooner or probably next week. And again, the Q&As, some of the questions we were not able to answer right away. They were very specific, so we'll try to get those on the website by pretty much a week from today. So by next Wednesday or sooner.
We'll get to the remaining questions in the Q&A.
Oh yes. Well, let me see. So do we need to submit a quote? Let's see. Do we need to submit a quote to substantiate vehicles cost or just an estimate budget timeline? If you have a quote already, and again, if it falls within that what we talked about, or the question that Doug answered, if it falls within that realm there. But if we can get it, if you can submit a quote, if not, I mean, we're going off of a very a good estimate there. If you have a good estimate of what something a vehicle is going to cost, because keep in mind, anything you are short of in the grant award, we're not looking to partially fund anything, so we're looking to fully fund something. So anything that you fell short on because a quote was not correct, will be will be absorbed by the non-entitlement, if anything.
What if a local city government is behind on completing an annual audit? Would the most recent audit be provided, or can the most recent?
Yeah, it just depends what year. If you can send us an email and let us know, because the NOFA was very specific, and I know some folks have actually asked that same question. So we basically referred back to the NOFA. So the NOFA was very clear on that. But there can also be different circumstances and whatnot. So if you can ask us that question in the email and let us know what year you have that, or what's the latest year you have, we can go from there. So, but that's the last question. Thank you, everyone. You guys provided some really good questions. So thank you, everyone. And then any other questions we get in the email along with these, we're going to put in our Q&A, and then we'll have that available. Good luck to everyone who is going to be submitting an application. This is a really good opportunity that we have, or that you have, for doing something substantial. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate you guys taking the time to log on and join us today. So we can end it, Kendall.